We gather also in the middle of a brutal pandemic that has taken the lives of far too many people, disproportionately affecting Black people, Latinx folks, and Indigenous peoples. This is the backdrop to our conversation today. And so, as we prepare to be in circle with one another, I want to take a moment and honor that we are all entering in different places. Perhaps for some of us, this is a newer conversation that was sparked by the events of the summer. For others of us, it's a conversation perhaps that we have often. And even though we're fatigued by it, we keep coming back because we are drawn to this work. We come back because we understand what Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said in his commencement address at Oberlin College, quote, "Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." For some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to be until you are who you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be, unquote. So regardless of where we are on this spectrum, we're entering this space. It's likely true that we have some variation of an age-old question: where do we go from here? I cannot promise to answer that question for you today, but I do hope to provide a framework and insight into how we might go from here. I've learned in my more than a decade of activism that more important than what we do each day is how we do it. That feels to me like the more urgent question. How do we move forward in a way that honors the trauma of racism for all of us and create space for courage, for creativity and innovation, and for compassion and compassionate action that will sustain us in what is a lifelong journey toward racial justice? This is the focus of our time together today. And so I want to invite us into a mindful moment this morning. I want to invite us to take a moment and center ourselves. And so if you're able, I want to invite you to sit comfortably in your seat, allowing the chair or whatever surface that's beneath you to support your body. If you're standing or lying down, that's fine. Just take a moment and get comfortable in whatever position you're in and feel the surface beneath you. If you need, you can turn your screen off, right? You can turn the video off on your screen, close your eyes, and I want to invite you to center with me in this moment. We center in this moment so that we can come to the present. There's so much on our to-do list, so many things we have to do after we leave this space together. We have to run to our next meetings, catch up on emails, tend to our kids who are schooling at home with us while we work at home. Care for loved ones, care for ourselves. And so I want to invite you to just center with me and to start to just notice your breathing. No need to change anything, just notice your breath. Notice the way that it goes in, flows through your body, and your release and exhale. As you begin to notice your breathing, I want to invite you to start to deepen your breathing. If you're able, breathe in your nose and out your mouth. Slow, deep breaths. Again, tracking your breath in your nose, through your lungs as your abdomen elevates and out your mouth. Centering yourself here, setting an intention to be present in this collective today for just these 2 hours together, to be present with one another. That doesn't mean that the other things on your plate aren't important, aren't urgent. Just that we're going to set an intention to the best of our abilities to be present with one another today. And to, in this moment of centering, return to our bodies. Notice what we're feeling in our bodies. Notice our thoughts, our emotions. And center ourselves and ground ourselves. Return to ourselves. Not to fret over the past, or have anxiety about the future, but to be here together. And so finally, I want to invite us to take one last deep breath in our nose, this time sort of forcing the air out of your mouth as you breathe, as you exhale. And when you're ready, you can return to the group. All right. So I'm going to take a moment and share my screen with you all. So thank you for centering with me. I want to take a moment now and get into our space of how do we stay on this racial equity journey. So I want to start by taking the opportunity for us to get acquainted with one another and answer this check-in question in small groups of about 3 or 4 folks of why is it important for you to be here today? And importantly, I want to invite us to focus on how you yourself will be changed by the journey, what you will gain, not just on how you will be able to help others. Obviously, we're motivated by our sense of collective responsibility to others. But in this check-in, I want us to focus on ourselves, be a little bit selfish for just a moment, and think about how you will benefit from staying on your racial equity journey. And so as we prepare to go into these breakout rooms, I actually want to offer up to us an invitation for a commitment to our collective to guide how we share time and space together with one another. These principles, I should say, that I'm going to invite us to adopt here are borrowed and adapted from 2 of my mentors who actually lead a lot of circle way trainings and a lot of deep change processes, Tennyson Wolf and Juanita Roberson. And so the first invitation for us today is to listen with attention. This really means doing our best to hear the words and insights that are being contributed by other people in our group. It means listening deeply for those similarities and differences across the stories, and really trying to find the meaning in the words that are behind the words. So going below the surface in our listening. Next is to speak with intention. I really want to invite us to do our best to speak what is clear for us in each of these moments of sharing, even if all that is clear is that you're confused or you don't know, right? That's okay, speak that. Discern as you're speaking, try to discern for you what's yours to contribute and what's not in those moments. And speak honestly. The third invitation is for us to really be intentional about contributing to the well-being of the groups. This means that we're going to do our best to fully participate with the groups. It means asking yourself, wait, the WAIT acronym, why am I talking? Why aren't I talking? Taking up space in a way that's meaningful and offering space to others. It also means considering the impact of your words before you're speaking and while you're engaging with one another. The fourth invitation is to practice courage. I'm going to invite you all throughout our 2 hours together to engage in deep reflection and sharing. So I want you to treat this as a space where you can practice courage and share with vulnerability and openness. Fifth, I want to remind us to maintain confidentiality. People's stories aren't for sharing on social media or spreading across your network. I know many of you work together and know each other, which is why the courage is going to be important in this space, but we're going to hold those personal stories confidential in this space. And then finally, I want to invite us to practice pause. It's okay and important, in fact, in our society to interrupt our habit of rushing. Ask for a moment to dwell on what has been spoken. If someone says something that really resonates, ask for a pause. And folks allow one another to pause in those moments. And so again, I'm going to send you all into groups of about 3 or 4 to answer the check-in question of why is it important for you to be here today? Welcome back, everybody. All right, so I want to share a little bit about our goals for today. So thank you all for taking that moment to get acquainted with one another, and yeah, just connect over your why for today. So I want to share a little bit of my goals for you all for today. My first goal is to really help to deepen our collective understanding of the anti-racism journey. And secondly, I really hope that this space can be a container for us where we can practice the deep work of race equity. And in doing so, really start to increase our capacity to do this work in the long term. And then finally, I hope to provide a path forward that is centered on both courage and compassion, right? That is centered on courage, that activates our creativity, and that centers around care and compassion. So, for the path of racial justice, we've all come to this path in different ways. As I shared earlier, for some of us, it was the events of the summer, or perhaps some other summer, right, that drove us to this space. For others of us, our racialized experiences as people with marginalized identities has made it impossible for us to ignore how racism is affecting our lives and those around us. Still, for others, it might be that you have that constant nagging sensation in your gut that just won't go away every time you encounter or witness racial harm happening in the world within or around you. That nagging sensation that just won't stop, no matter how much society incentivizes you to not notice it or to not care about the pain and the harm caused due to racism. In other words, we each have experienced in our lives multiple moments that have awakened us to the realities of the world. Whether those awakenings happen because of our intrinsic disposition to not want to witness the harm, or because we ourselves had a felt experience of harm, or we bared witness to a magnitude of harm that we just could not ignore, right? We're all coming to this experience in those ways. We're experiencing a multitude of these moments that awaken us to the realities of the world around us and causes us to remember the truth of the value of all human lives and the reality that in our society that is not often held up. In these moments, we reach a crossroad in which the realities of the moments we're encountering are conflicting with the world that we long to have and that perhaps we once believed we had. We experience these moments with great discomfort, and we're often driven to great lengths to avoid encountering them again. This is because, like most people, we all in this space want to believe that the world is just. We wish the world was just, right? Each moment of awakening, each of those instances is a challenge to that moment, to that idea, to that notion of just. And the more moments that we allow ourselves to notice, the more our notions of our country as one that is anchored in freedom, justice, and prosperity becomes harder and harder to believe. Even more painful, I've found, than the experience of having our notions of a just world shattered through these ongoing moments of racial awakening are those moments in which we hold up the mirror and we're forced to acknowledge the ways that we ourselves are either actively or passively complicit in maintaining white supremacy culture in our world. So I want to share an example. It took me several years to learn what it truly meant to be anti-racist in the workplace. So I've had the luxury of spending my entire professional career working in social justice organizations. And oftentimes we spend our days wagging our fingers at people saying, shame on you for the injustice that you're perpetrating, right? Over time, I've come to realize that while we're often really good at telling others what they need to do, we're not always so good at doing those things ourselves, right? And this was true for me too, right? And so one dynamic that I encountered time and time again was witnessing my fellow non-white colleagues rather, being tokenized in the workplace. I remember one time in particular where it became fairly apparent that one of my colleagues had only been invited to work on a project because she was Latinx, and the partners we were working with were also Latinx. It was clear in part because the role she was given did not align with her skill sets. And she would often complain to me that she felt like her contributions weren't really being valued or taken seriously by the team. And so I knew from watching this that she was being tokenized, but I didn't say anything. I knew that she was only invited to give the illusion of diversity on our team. I knew this, but I didn't advocate on her behalf or even give her the language to understand her experience so that she could advocate for herself, right? I kept quiet because I was trying to preserve my own standing, right? I was concerned about rocking the boat. I didn't want to start no issues at the workplace, right? But in maintaining my silence, I myself became complicit in institutional racism. The reality is we all have those mirror moments, those instances where we become aware of how we ourselves are complicit in perpetuating racial harm. Or perhaps our mirror moments are ones in which other people are holding up the mirror for us and saying, hey, this you're falling short in this space. You were quiet in this moment where I needed your allyship, I needed your support. That made you know better than what was happening around, right? And so I want to take a moment and explore these mirror moments. I want to again send you into your groups of four to explore this prompt of sharing a story about when you were either actively or passively through your inaction perpetuating racial harm. Again, it can be a story where you knew it was happening. Like I realized I had the language and the knowledge to understand that in that moment, I had made a conscious choice to stay silent out of fear, right? I knew it was happening. Or it can be a moment where someone else brought it to your attention. And then after everyone has had an opportunity to share, I want you to reflect on how it felt to recall that moment and how that moment has shaped who you are. Again, this is a space where I'm inviting us into courageousness, right? Inviting you to practice courage and to reflect on your mirror moments. And so I'm going to put in the chat the prompt, and again, a reminder of our commitment to our collective as you all explore this together. Awesome. Welcome back again, everybody. So I want to take a moment now and invite us to practice pause. We just shared a lot. You were invited to share a lot, I should say. And so I want to take a moment and just practice pausing. I want you to just ask yourself and notice, what are you noticing in your body in this moment? What are you noticing in your thoughts? And then what are you noticing in your emotions? Perhaps you notice yourself holding tension in your body. Maybe you're feeling some discomfort, right, in your abdomen area, your gut space. Maybe your thoughts are racing, or you're noticing that you're resistant to being asked to share and recall and share those stories. That you're feeling some guilt or some shame that was uncovered by sharing your story. Whatever is coming up, I just want to invite us to pause and observe it for a moment. And then when you're ready, tend to whatever you need in that moment. If you find yourself feeling guilt or shame, resistance, tension, send yourself some love and compassion in this moment. If you're feeling tension in your body, maybe you can shake it out, right? Move a little bit. That always helps to move things. Calm your emotions or any negative thoughts. That's just taking a few deep breaths and sharing some love and kindness with yourself. If you're experiencing resistance, right, and you're like, what does this lady got me doing, right? If that's your disposition right now, I want to invite you to set an intention to remain open to the rest of this experience. Whatever you need to do, just take a moment and care for yourself. We pause because the trauma of racism is lodged within us. Just talking about racialized experiences is hard. We're not practiced at it. And it often triggers a trauma response for us, whether that's fight, right, to be defensive and fight, to flee, appeasement, bracing or freezing, disassociate, kind of disengaging and disconnecting. And so Trauma is part of this journey. And so we have to nurture ourselves so that we can stay engaged, right? We have to be able to be honest, practice reflection and introspection, and stay engaged in the journey even when it's hard. And so the big idea here is that for most folks, holding up the mirror is hard because we've been conditioned to believe that only bad people participate in racism, right? Only bad people do those things. Only bad people have anything to do with harmful systems of oppression, whether it's white supremacy, patriarchy, or whatever it may be. This, I really believe, is one of the greatest fallacies of our time. It keeps us from engaging in a radical honesty and courage that is needed if we are going to build a better world, if we're going to create anti-racist institutions and movements, right? We have to be able to hold up the mirror and understand that it's not about being a good or bad person. The other big idea here is that we've been taught to view the world as just and equitable. And even though we who have come to this space, we know that's not true. That's why we're here, right? We've had our moments of awakening that have called us to this place to say something else has to be possible, because what I was told to believe about our country in particular is not true. Each moment challenges our understanding of America. And so this leads to the question of what then is the path of racial justice? What does it mean to do the deep work of racial justice? I'm going to share 4 components that I think are integral to whatever path of racial justice you're pursuing. The first is that we have to be willing to hold up the mirror and investigate our own complicity. It is so common for us to project into the world. We also have to look inward and ask ourselves, what roles do we play? Have we internalized white supremacy? What are the stories that we've told ourselves or listened to about who we are and who others are? And when have we stayed silent in the face of racial harm? When have we failed to act with courage? We have to be willing to hold up the mirror. The second component is that we have to be willing to commit to no longer actively or passively participating in white supremacy, especially when we have been made aware of the ways in which we are doing so. Of course, this can't be done universally. This is the water that we swim in, it's the air that we breathe, right? But what it is possible is setting an intention to not knowingly do so, not knowingly actively participate, or staying silent in the face of injustice. The third component is committing to acting with courage and creativity as we build a more equitable world. I borrowed this from Reverend Nelson Pierce Jr. of Beloved Community Church here in Cincinnati, who spoke about this during his MLK keynote address 2 weeks ago. He shared that we need both courage and creativity in our vision if we're going to build a beloved community. This really resonates with me. We need courage because this is hard. It's hard to interrupt those moments. It's hard to be in to leverage our own power, our own privilege, our own positionality, and even risk certain things in order to move with courage. It's hard work. And we need creativity because we don't honestly really know what we're doing. I say that to people all the time when they're like, how do we do that? I'm like, no one really knows. If somebody knew, they would have been a millionaire patenting it already, right? We're involved in a social experiment. We're going to have to dream up new ways of being and thinking in order to achieve true liberation from white supremacy for all people, right? And so we need courage and creativity. And then finally, we have to be prepared to fall short and make mistakes. You will get it wrong on this path. You're going to find yourself again and again cycling through and realizing, like, dang, that was a moment where I allowed that to continue. I failed to interrupt harm, or I perpetuated harm, right? We're going to fall short. The goal is not perfection, it's commitment to getting back on the path. In doing so with compassion towards yourself in those moments of failure. So I really believe that if we commit to these 4 components, other opportunities for us to engage in institutional and systemic acts of social justice are going to be revealed to us. We so often want to jump into the work and jump into the world and say, give me the plan, the blueprint of do A, B, and C, right? Let's do this with policy. Let's do this with this. We first have to start here with ourselves. If we commit to these four things, I really believe that it will be revealed to us. It will be easier as we hold up our mirrors, right? And sensitize ourselves to the world around us. It will be easier to identify leverage points and areas where we can have influence in the world. To take this path, there's a few things that we must be willing to do. We have to be willing to sensitize ourselves to the moments of awakening within and around us. This requires us to turn toward those painful realities that we have been conditioned to avoid. We have been taught to avoid. In fact, our society has been structured to minimize our need to see them. We are segregated economically so that we don't have to see poverty and feel the guilt and shame of witnessing people go without, right? That's one way that our society is set up for that. We are not proximate in communities across race, especially here in Cincinnati, which is extremely racially segregated by neighborhood, even today. And so we don't have to be made aware of the ways in which racism harms us all in different ways. We're conditioned to not notice the ways that our gut is nagging at us when we ourselves are being harmed, the ways that we've been kept separate from ourselves and others as a result of racism. So we have to be willing to turn toward the painful realities. It also requires us to be willing to shed skewed images of ourselves as innocent non-participants in this journey, right? We are taught to see ourselves as innocent and benevolent and non-participant people. And in doing so, we tend to treat extreme instances of racial inequities as anomalies or outliers that can be scapegoated to one individual or moment. But as we hold up the mirror and we start to see the ways that we all are susceptible to embodying white supremacy in our actions, it becomes harder to scapegoat it. We then have to look at the bigger picture. And these are requirements of the path of racial justice. I found over the years that this process of turning toward what I call radical honesty, right? This is radical honesty and truth. It brings with it, for a lot of folks, a sense of loss and grief. It brings with us loss and grief because our ability to align our behavior and our values, we see that gap between our behavior and our values. But our ability to make that alignment happen requires that we make room for grief. It requires that we actually feel that sense of loss of ideals of ourselves in the world. This is the heart of what I want to offer to you today. I want to offer you today the reality that our ability to engage in the necessary soul work of racial justice, that soul work that we have to do if we're going to creatively build equitable systems. Our ability to do that work requires us to be willing to recognize and allow grief to be a part of that process. And so the question then is, what does this look like in the context of racial justice? Quote, what I was doing was waking up in a way that the blinders were off. And I was seeing the world for the way it was. And that was really, really sad for me. And I needed time to mourn what I knew to be true, end quote. This was shared by a young activist in Columbus during an interview with the Columbus Dispatch. This was following the suicide death of actually one of my dear friends, Amber Evans, who was widely known and loved across the state for her work in racial justice and juvenile justice. Following her suicide, the Columbus Dispatch did a series of articles, and they were investigating and really seeking to shine light on the mental health toll of activism on the organizers in the city, because Amber was one of multiple Black organizers in particular in Columbus who had committed suicide over the last several years. I found this particular quote compelling because it really speaks to the heart of how grief, if not dealt with, right? If we don't allow it, acknowledge it, and allow room for it, how grief can manifest in our racial justice work, right? It's true whether we're underground organizers like they are, DEI consultants or specialists, systems changers, researchers, or just individuals, right, who are doing whatever we can and whatever roles we have. If we're truly doing the work of racial equity, which includes holding up our mirrors and committing to truly sensitizing ourselves to the world around us, we will experience a sense of loss and grief with it. As psychologist Eleanor Haley wrote in a 2015 blog post, quote, regardless the scenario, the loss of hopes and dreams can be incredibly hard to accept and cope with. These losses aren't just felt in one time in a person's life. True to grief form, they pop up as milestones, reminders, birthdays, important events, regrets, and emptiness forever. And so what does this look like in the context of racial justice and what I'm calling the soul work of racial equity? To illustrate this, I'm going to go through an adaptive version of the stages of grief and share learnings of how I've both personally experienced and witnessed these dynamics manifesting along the path of racial justice. As I share these examples, I want you to just notice which feels familiar for you. Some important things to think about as we're going through these stages is that first, they are not inherently sequential. They're really just meant to provide categories of the phases of the process, regardless of the order of occurrence. Given this, it's possible to enter anywhere along the continuum. So while I will go through them in what will feel like a sequential manner of one, then the next, and the next, it's possible to enter anywhere. You don't have to enter at the stage that I start with. Secondly, it's possible to get stuck in stages. This is again why we have to create space for grief. Otherwise, we get stuck in stages. And it's possible to be in multiple stages simultaneously. And then finally, it's important to understand that this isn't a process that we're going to finish, just true to grief and any other form of loss, this is an ongoing experience for us. I've noticed the ways in which I cycle again and again throughout different facets of these stages of grief, as I again and again are confronted with these moments of extreme violence and hatred and racism, and these moments of introspection in which I notice the ways that I have a gap between my espoused values and my actions. And so the first stage I want to elevate is shock or disbelief. This usually occurs in the immediate aftermath of an occurrence of explicit racism, or in the moments where we first become aware of racial dynamics that have always been present around us. These are those moments of awakening, or the moments where this is most prevalent. People all over the world experienced that this summer in 2020. Some of the examples of things people say in this stage when faced with the realities of race and racism are, I can't believe after all this time, things like this are still happening, right? We're willing to acknowledge that this used to be the norm in our country, but it's hard for folks to acknowledge that this is still happening. That's that sense of disbelief or shock at what's happening around us. Next is denial. Denial is one of the ways that I've noticed that we attempt to preserve our notions of ourselves and the world around us. This is different than disbelief that's born out of shock, right? Instead, I've noticed that denial manifests most often as a conscious decision to not face the truths of how race is shaping our reality. For white folks, I've noticed this most often as a way of preserving the notion of some of themselves as a good person, right? And to minimize the ways in which their own racial privilege has enabled their success in life. Alternatively, for people of color, I often notice this as an attempt to reclaim a sense of empowerment and self-determination by minimizing the role of institutional and structural racism on their lives. In other words, denial, like shock and disbelief, is really just a trauma response to the pain of racial injustice. What this often sounds like in conversations are when folks say things like, I don't see color, or I'm not a race, I'm human, right? We've heard those over the years. That's a manifestation of denial. That's an avoidance of the truths of how race is shaping our lives. Then there's shame and guilt. As we hold up the mirror, we're going to be faced with immense feelings of guilt and shame over the many ways that we ourselves are susceptible to participating in white supremacy, as well as the ways that we've internalized anti-Blackness, anti-Asianness, right? Anti-Latinxness, anti-Indigenousness, all the ways we've internalized racial bias. What's important to note is that if we don't create space for these feelings, we become crippled by them. If we don't process them, they can cripple us. It can make us so afraid of doing farther harm or being farther disempowered that we are immobilized. Examples of what this might sound like is when folks say things like, my community has done so much harm in the world. This acknowledgement is true. It's vital for us to move forward. We have to have radical honesty to move forward. But with it, though, comes often a weight of guilt. It's important to let that guilt have space in our hearts and minds while not becoming overwhelmed by it. Other thoughts are, in those mirror moments, am I bad for not speaking up? Or for folks who are experiencing a lot of explicit marginalization, why do we keep being targeted or mistreated? Why do they keep doing this to us, right? That's that shame, that's that guilt. We also have the bargaining stage. I've noticed this manifest in the racial equity journey when we attempt to both maintain our skewed beliefs of our own innocence or of the world as a just and equitable place, but we still need to try to make sense of the reality that we're witnessing. This occurs when we can't really bring ourselves to deny it outright, right? But we're not really fully ready to accept the truth. I argue that the vast majority of our nation is constantly in a space of bargaining. We bargain when we think or say things like it's really a class issue, not a race issue. We bargain when we say, had they not been doing X and Y, wouldn't have happened. We've heard that a lot with the killings of unarmed Black people. Well, Michael Brown was shot because Michael Brown stole a candy bar or something. I don't know. There's always a rationalization, a way to justify racial violence, right? Or for our own self-preservation, we'll say things like, well, I only did X because they did Y and it had nothing to do with race at all. It wasn't about the race. It was because they did this thing, right? Here we're trying to preserve our sense of innocence, racialized innocence, while still acknowledging the outcomes connected to our actions. And finally, I often hear this within Black communities. Folks will say things like, how can we get mad they're killing us when we're killing us? As though it's not universally true that people are more likely to die at the hands of someone that looks like them because we live in very segregated communities. Then there's anger and blaming. We typically move toward anger in one of two instances, either when the pain of what is happening leaves us feeling helpless or so deeply hurt that we're unable to immediately process that pain. We also move toward anger when we're trying to deflect responsibility away from ourselves. This is what Dr. Robin DiAngelo is talking about in her book, White Fragility. This is one of the dynamics she mentions. It's important to note that while on the surface, anger may seem bad, it's not inherently bad. It often gives us the fuel we need to move toward courageous action. It's why in the organizing space, for those who are in the grassroots space, you may notice that anger is encouraged to be in the room, right? Anger is something that's invited openly into the space. What I think folks fail to understand, though, and not just in organizing space, but in a policy space as well, right? In different spaces where anger is the fuel toward action, it cannot sustain long-term action. Folks gotta be anchored in something deeper so that when the anger dies down, which it always does, especially once we turn toward the anger and accept that it's there, it fizzles away. So when the anger dies down, we have to be anchored into something else in order to stay engaged in the movement. Another stage is depression. It often manifests through apathy and disengagement. Folks in this stage tend to struggle with feelings of powerlessness. They're often immobilized by the sadness that they feel and their perception that nothing they do is going to matter anyway. People often say or think things like the world sucks, this is too much, or the problem is bigger than me, there's nothing I can do about it. How can I fix all this? Or I often hear from people of color, I hear things like, well, I gave up on white people a long time ago. They're never going to change. That's apathy, right? That's not acceptance. It can sometimes be disguised as acceptance, but it's actually apathy. There's nothing I can do. I gave up on them, which is very different than accepting, like, currently this is what the world is like, but I have a vision for what's possible still. If you find yourself in this space, it's important for you to know, firstly, that it's completely normal to have experiences of depression along your journey. And it's also important to seek professional help and external support, right? Seek a therapist, seek communities of care where you can be around other folks who are going to encourage you and help you see the possibilities of what could be beyond what currently is. Seek support if you find yourself in this space. You don't have to sit in this space alone. The reality is the system of white supremacy, like patriarchy, like harmful practices connected to capitalism, imperialism, all these different harmful systems that fail to value the humanity and dignity of our people. They're larger than any one person. So it's natural to start to have enough moments of awakening where you look around and it feels overwhelming, or feel like despite everything that folks have tried to do over the last few centuries, nothing's happening. So what's the point? Again, this is why it's important to have an anchor and clarity about why you're committed to the path, because otherwise you'll throw your hands up and you'll say things like, this is a gravity problem. I'm not doing this anymore. In these moments, you have to have something else to hold on to. And so finally, there's a stage that I call towards acceptance, right? Because I don't think most of us will ever truly reach a point of radical acceptance. It's something we can work toward, radical acceptance. Instead, I believe we're going to spend much of our lives having to commit again and again of working toward this stage, finding emotional and psychological acceptance and balance. Importantly, again, I want to stress this because it's so easy for this to happen. It's not, I don't want us to confuse acceptance with apathy that is disguised as acceptance. Folks who are truly in this space of working toward acceptance are on the upturn in terms of their ability to process what's happening while still imagining new ways of being in the world together. They're not throwing their hands up and saying, what can I do? They're saying, wow, this sucks, this is heavy, this is hard. And also, here's where we can go. Here's what's possible. They're actively engaged in the experience of radical honesty and truth, but they're still able, importantly, to find joy, right? There has to be joy in this process. I could not stay in this journey this long if I don't have moments of joy, moments of vision, moments of hope and possibility. I found that this is only possible for most folks when we continue our unlearning and our awakening and supporting and loving communities. When we have external supports that can help to reflect back to us hope when we feel hopeless. When we have a community of practice who are also rigorously engaged in holding up the mirror even when it's hard. So we're not holding up the mirror while surrounded by people who are choosing to maintain ignorance. And so as you reflect on these stages, I want you to think about these stages for yourself and how you've noticed them manifesting in your life. What's emerging for you? I'm going to send you again back into your groups to explore these questions of where are you at in this moment? Where do you find yourself most often? I'm going to link to a worksheet in the chat that's going to summarize these stages for you on a one-pager. And as you reflect on where you are in this moment, I want you to remember that no stage is bad or wrong or uncommon. They're all common. I was able to make these connections as I was working through my own personal trauma and doing race equity research because they're so common that it's everywhere, right? There's nothing bad about any stage. So practice courage and honesty in your conversations. And we are going to send you back into your breakout rooms. All right, welcome back, everybody. So folks can mute yourself as you return back to the main room. So what's the big idea here? The big idea is that the loss of our ideals about ourselves, right, as well as the loss of our notions of the world as a just and equitable place, and as our country in particular as a just place, can bring with it deep grief. This is a normal part of the path of racial equity. This is part of that soul work journey. And so we have to make room for it. And so then let's turn back to those four components I elevated of what the path can look like for racial justice. I want to add to that because, yes, we have to be willing to hold up the mirror and investigate ourselves. We have to be willing to interrupt our active and passive participation in white supremacy. Of course, we must act with courage and creativity as we build an equitable world. We have to prepare to fall short and have compassion for ourselves and get back on the path. And also, we have to be willing to recognize and allow grief to be a part of our journey. This is going to be a journey where compassion and care is needed because grief is on this path with us. It will follow us throughout our journey. And so now what? How do we move forward from here, right? What do we do to incorporate compassion and care into our activism, into our work to be anti-racist individuals and to build anti-racist institutions and systems? First, we have to tap into our longing, tap into your longing. I want you all to, if you're able, write down these questions and journal them for yourself if you've not done it. Why this path? Why racial equity? How is white supremacy hurting you? This is particularly important for white folks who have not been taught to see and notice and have a conscious understanding of the ways in which you are hurt by white supremacy. But I know from personal experience, it is hard to sustain doing something really hard if I'm only doing it for other people. So you have to investigate why you are doing it. How are you being harmed by the status quo? What is your why for that? And then we all have to ask ourselves, who do we want to be? What is our longing for our lives? And how will this journey help us to grow into those people? The second step is for us to acknowledge the pain. It is painful to have our sense of ourselves in a world disrupted and shifted. Change is hard. While Octavia Butler says that change is inevitable, right? Everything we touch is change, and everything that changes, that we touch is changed by us, and we change it, right? You know, that's part of her parable series. For folks who haven't read Octavia Butler, I strongly encourage it. And so change is inevitable, right? But it's still painful. Shifting our perceptions of ourselves and the world around us is hard, but it is necessary in order to move toward equity. We have to be willing to face the truth of things, but that is painful. And so we have to acknowledge the pain. Don't feel sad or bad about being pained by this journey. And then we have to cultivate communities of care. We have to cultivate both affinity and intercultural spaces for healing and restoration, learning and unlearning. There has to be communities and spaces where we can try and fail, where we can hold one another accountable to holding up the mirror and to moving with courage and action, right? We have to be willing to cultivate affinity and intercultural spaces. We have to be willing to dare to dream. We can't just go about trying to tear down systems and interrupt things. We also have to build a vision of what is possible. And so another question I want to invite you to write down and to ruminate on for yourself, and perhaps to ruminate on with your team members, those that you work with, those that you live with, your families, right? We often forget to start with our families, the people in your neighborhood, whatever religious institutions you frequent, if you do, right? Ask this question: what is the world you like to build? You know, one of the things that I learned in my own process and journey of really moving through my childhood trauma was that I could not just let go of harmful coping strategies and my adaptive strategies. I can't just let them go. In fact, I can never leave them fully, which is a different conversation, but I can't just let them go. I had to develop positive coping strategies for trauma and stress in order to override my adaptive strategies. Remember, racism manifests as trauma that lives in our bodies, in our brains, right? It lives in our thoughts. It lives in our emotional responses and triggers to stimulus. And so we have to give ourselves something else to hold on to, or we will always default back to these ways of being together and acting that we have come to know so well. What is the world you'd like to build? We also have to be willing to invite compassion. Be kind to yourself while on this journey. I'm going to share a few ways that you can invite compassion. One is to practice pause. We did this together earlier. We don't give enough space and acknowledgement to just how hard it is to have conversations about race in our country. It is really hard to do so. It's not useful to shame ourselves for being challenged by it. It's hard to move with courage toward anti-racism. We should not shame ourselves when it's hard, but we can practice pause. When we have those moments where an event is triggering us, or a conversation has been really hard, or we've had to share as part of holding up our mirror something that's deep personal and that might bring us shame or guilt, practice pause. You can do this on your own. Just ask yourself, what am I noticing in my body? What am I noticing in my thoughts? What am I noticing in my emotions? And after you practice pause, I want to invite us to practice RAIN. This is an acronym for Recognize, Allow, Investigate, and Nurture that comes from Dr. Tara Brach. It's part of it's a big part of her work around compassion. She has a book called Radical Compassion, Learning to Love Yourself in the World with the Practice of RAIN. I highly recommend Radical Compassion and her book on radical acceptance. But she shares this practice in her work, right? Recognizing what is happening. That practicing of a pause that I just shared is a way to do that first step of R. And then allow that experience to be there just as it is. It is not necessary when you recognize what is happening within and around you to change it. Just allow it to be there. And once you've given space to it being there, and you've come to accept that it is there, and trying not to change it or to name or to label it or judge it, just allow it to be there. You can investigate what's happening with interest and care. Asking yourself questions around, why am I having this reaction? Oh, I'm defensive. Why am I defensive, right? What is this defensiveness about? One thing that helps me with this investigation space is to recognize that most of the harm that I produce personally, and I've witnessed this to be true for others, is often related to a fracture in my sense of dignity, belonging, connection, right? One of these different facets, these core things that we need to be well. Our sense of belonging is fractured. And so we're having a reaction. Our sense of dignity, how we see ourselves and our value. If you're used to seeing yourself as a good person and you associate racism with only bad people, then having the mirror held up to you is going to feel like an affront to your sense of self, right? And so asking yourself, what's being fractured that I need to tend to in this moment? And then nurturing yourself with compassion, right? Tending to the needs that arise in that moment. I want to offer an opportunity for how to nurture yourself. This comes from Rhonda McGee, the author of the book, The Inner Work of Racial Justice, Healing Ourselves and Transforming Our Communities Through Mindfulness. There's so many mindfulness practices you can adopt. Her book offers several of them. There's a lot of practitioners across a number of disciplines, some religious-based, some not religious-based, though I would argue all spiritual-based. That you can adopt to help learn how to nurture yourself. Here's a mantra. Feel free to write this down and to use this as you are trying to invite compassion to yourself, or look up other loving kindness meditations where you are sending yourself in the world love and kindness. Here she invites us to center ourselves, get grounded, put your hand on your heart, put your hands across your heart, and to say this to yourself: this is a moment of racial discomfort. Such moments are common in a world shaped by racism. I deserve kindness in this moment, and I offer kindness to others impacted by this moment. Nurture yourself and invite compassion. The sixth thing I want to invite us to do along our journey is to build our capacity. We are not practiced with doing this work. We are not practiced with even conversing about race, yet alone acting in an anti-racist manner. We are not practiced in this. We have to build our capacity. We have to develop and maintain a practice of honest reflection and introspection. It will be hard as you are starting, as those of you who've been on this path for a while know. And over time, it gets easier. And we can never stop. No matter how far we feel we have come, there's still farther to go. And so develop and maintain a practice and engage in active learning and listening about racial inequity. I have a bachelor's degree in Pan-African Studies, and still I am constantly reading and learning and trying to understand the nuanced ways that race shows up in my life and in the world around me, right? I'm always engaged in active learning and listening. I'm always asking people of different cultural backgrounds about their experiences. And then listening with empathy, listening for those similarities and differences. It doesn't matter how far you've come, you should still build your capacity by engaging in active learning and listening. And then finally, but definitely not least, I want to invite us to allow and expect joy. This path is hard. I'm a part of a community of practice centered around polarity, which is it's a way of a disposition to the world, a way of tapping into our energy, orienting ourselves to the life source within us and around us. And in this community, one of my teachers often says, choose your heart. It's hard to stay connected to yourself. It's hard to turn inward and tap into the life within you because we've taught in our world not to do so. It's hard. And also it's hard to be disconnected from yourself, right? It's hard to do the work of anti-racism. And also it's hard to stay in a system that keeps you separate from yourself, that creates harm in the world. So choose your heart, right? This path is gonna be hard. But one thing that I've learned is that it's much more rewarding to engage in a path of anti-racism, to turn inward and tap into who I am at my core and not what the world is saying about me. The work of racial equity provides us a gateway to us realizing our full potential and being our true selves. And in that process, you are going to laugh. You are going to experience joy. You're going to have these moments of aha. You're going to learn to see those moments of failure and awakening within yourself as you hold up your mirror as with more welcome each time. It'll become easier and easier to look at it and say, oh yeah, I recognize this. Okay, let me dig in and do this, right? And with that acceptance of that journey, of that cyclical process, comes joy and appreciation for the moments and the opportunities that the world is giving you to grow into your best self, right? So allow and expect joy and have fun. I used to believe that I would say when I was in undergrad, oh, to be so naive, I would often say, I can't rest until the world is better, right? That is ridiculous. If I don't rest until the world is better, I won't rest my entire life. And so I had to get past that and to understand that I have to allow and expect joy in my journey, which doesn't mean I don't still work rigorously for equity and change. It means that I also can laugh with my son and can look at him and see the light, can spend time with my partner and allow that love to cover me in that moment. And so the big idea is that our racial equity journey must include compassion and healing, as well as that courageous action and creativity. We can't only focus on that hard stuff and not give ourselves compassion and healing. How we do the work we do is just as important as what you do, if not more important. If we are not holding ourselves with care and inviting compassion and healing into our activist spaces, we are going to perpetuate and create systems that are harmful within our movements, that are no better than the world that we're trying to shift. So we have to include compassion and healing, reconciliation, radical honesty and truth in our process. And so I just want to do one final 5-minute checkout connection. In your smile groups for just 4 or 5 minutes, I want to invite us to answer this question of what is one thing you are leaving with today? It's so great to see smiling faces as you all return back. So I just want to close out then with a quote from Anne Frank. I keep my ideals because, in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. Thank you all so much for your time, your attention, for your courage in having the conversations. I know I invited you all very early in our time together to share, and so I appreciate you all engaging in this process so far. Rashida, is there anything you want to say as we close out?
I just want to thank you for this. This was fantastic. I mean, I've been in a lot of racial justice and kind of equity workshops, but I appreciate the way that you facilitated today. You were just amazing.
Thank
And
you.
I just, I'm excited. I'm leaving today feeling rejuvenated and ready to continue this work. And I'm excited by the number of people who came out today to participate. And I just want you all to know that Green Umbrella is committed to this work. And we hope that you'll continue to join us on this journey as we move forward towards building a race equity culture within the environmental justice movement here in Cincinnati. And again, Robin, I just want to say thank you to you. You are just amazing.
Thank
And if
you.
everyone here can give her a round of applause or whatever,
Aw,
let's do that.
thank you.